This 1894 a wedding photograph. A bride and groom standing side by side in 1894. Their faces frozen in time. At first look, it seemed like an ordinary wedding portrait from that era. Formal, calm, and nothing unusual. But look closer. Look at her hands. The bride's hands tell a story that words could never tell. Deep scars, clear and deliberate, marked her skin. What happened to this woman? Why was she standing next to a man who, by all the laws and customs of that time, should never have married her? And why did someone hide this photograph for more than 130 years? This is not just a wedding photo. It is proof. Proof of something that should never have been seen. Proof of a secret so dangerous that it could have cost them both their lives. Today we finally learn the truth. If stories like this touch you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. Because what comes next will change how you see American history. The demolition crew was set to arrive on Monday. By Friday, the house would be nothing but rubble. 11 years of legal fights, unpaid taxes, and government neglect had finally decided its fate. The Victorian mansion at the end of Oakwood Road in Natchez, Mississippi, once a symbol of wealth and Southern pride, would soon be gone forever. Helen first saw the house on a humid afternoon in late August 2023. She worked as a senior archivist for the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. She had volunteered to lead the final documentation before the demolition. It was normal work, the kind she had done many times before. Photograph the rooms, list any items left behind, finish the paperwork, then move on. But this house felt different. The moment she stepped onto the old porch, something changed in the air. The smell of decay and age mixed with the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms. Inside, the walls were covered in water damage, and the floorboards creaked under her boots. Furniture lay broken and scattered, left behind by the last person who lived there, an old woman named Dorothy. County records showed she had died alone in 2012, with no children or family to claim her things. Helen moved through the first floor carefully, her camera clicking in the quiet. Parlor, dining room, kitchen. Nothing special, just the usual remains of a forgotten life. It was the attic that changed everything. The stairs to the attic were narrow and unsafe, with several steps missing. Helen climbed slowly, her flashlight cutting through the dark. The attic was tight and stuffy, the air thick with dust that made her eyes water. There were broken chairs, piles of old newspapers, and a child's rocking horse with one leg gone. In the far corner, half hidden under a fallen shelf, sat a small leather trunk. Helen knelt beside it. The leather was cracked and worn, but the brass locks still worked. She opened them carefully, her fingers shaking with a feeling she could not explain. Inside, wrapped in old newspapers from 1932, was a photograph. She held it up to the light. It was a wedding portrait, a white man in a dark suit and a black woman in a simple white dress. The date at the bottom read 1894. Helen's heart stopped. Helen did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk in Jackson, the photograph leaning against her computer screen. She could not look away. The groom had a firm jaw and quiet strength. The bride held her chin high, her eyes showing something close to victory. But it was her hands that stayed with Helen. Under the magnifying glass, the details were clear. The bride's hands, folded at her waist, showed thick rope-like scars that crossed her palms and circled her wrists. These were not scars from an accident or sickness. They were the scars of bondage, from ropes, shackles, and years of hard labor that tore the skin again and again. Helen had studied photos of formerly enslaved people. She knew these marks, but the Civil War had ended in 1865, almost 30 years before this photo was taken. By 1894, this woman should have been free, so why did she still carry such fresh wounds? The next morning, Helen contacted James, a historian at Howard University who knew a lot about post-Civil War Southern history. She sent him clear scans of the photograph and waited. His reply came quickly. "Where did you find this?" he asked. She told him about the abandoned house, the leather trunk, and the 1932 newspapers. Helen, James said slowly, I think I know what this is. Those scars match something called debt peonage. After the war, many plantation owners used legal tricks to keep black workers trapped on their land. They used unfair sharecropping contracts, fake debts that could never be paid, and vagrancy laws that made it a crime to be without work. The workers were called free, but they could not leave. They were beaten if they tried. Some were worked until they died. Helen looked at the photograph again, at the bride's hands and the groom standing beside her. But she married him. Helen said, she married the son of her captors. That's what we need to figure out, James replied. Who was she? Who was he? And how did they end up in that photograph together? The search for answers had begun. Helen started with property records. For the next 2 weeks she worked in the Natchez courthouse, going through old deeds, tax papers, and census records that went back before the Civil War. The Victorian house on Oakwood Road had been built in 1887 by a family that moved from Virginia after the war. Before 1865, they had owned a large cotton plantation and more than 300 enslaved people. After emancipation, they sold their Virginia land, moved to Mississippi, bought new property, and rebuilt their wealth through sharecropping. The family head, a strict man named Cornelius, ran everything with a hard hand. His 3 sons handled the daily work, collecting debts, enforcing contracts, and making sure the workers could never leave. In the 1870 census, Helen found a list of laborers on the property. Among them was a girl named Eliza, 12 years old, listed as colored and working as a domestic servant. By 1880, Eliza was still there. Now 22, she was still called a servant, still tied to the same family. But in the 1900 census, everything was different. Eliza was no longer listed as a servant. She was now the wife of Thomas, the youngest son of Cornelius. They had 2 children, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Grace, both listed as mulatto. Helen leaned back, her heart beating fast. The bride in the photograph was Eliza. The groom was Thomas. Somehow, against all odds, they had married and started a family. The 1900 census was taken 6 years after the wedding photo. What had happened in those years? How had this marriage survived in a world built to destroy it? Helen needed the family's private papers. County records showed the documents had been given to the Natchez Historical Society in 1978 by a distant relative who wanted nothing to do with the family's past. The papers had stayed untouched in storage ever since. Helen called the society that afternoon. The Natchez Historical Society was in an old antebellum home on Pearl Street. Its rooms were filled with shelves of old documents and forgotten items. The curator, an elderly man named Walter, took Helen to a basement storage room where 12 cardboard boxes were stacked against the wall. Nobody has touched these in 40 years, Walter said. Good luck. Helen started working. The boxes held a mix of personal letters, legal papers, business receipts, and family photos. She sorted them by date, took pictures of each page, and built a timeline of the family's life after the war. The letters showed how they ran their sharecropping business. Crop amounts, equipment buys, and complaints about workers. In the third box, she found a bundle of labor contracts, tied with an old ribbon. Each contract was a printed form with handwritten details. Workers agreed to labor on the land for housing, food, and a share of the harvest. But the small print was cruel. Workers were charged for tools, lodging, food, and seeds. Interest grew every month. If they missed quotas, penalties were added. If they tried to leave before paying, they could be arrested. It was slavery in every way except the name. Among the contracts Helen found Eliza's, dated 1867 when she was only 9. The paper listed her as a debtor to the estate. Her mother had died the year before, still owing money. Eliza had inherited the debt. She was bound to the land until it was paid. At the interest rates and penalties listed, the debt would have taken over 100 years to clear. She had been born free, but sentenced to a lifetime of bondage. Thomas was different from his brothers. The letters showed his older brothers, William and Robert were loyal to their father's ways. They ran the workers with cruelty. Thomas rarely appeared in the business letters. When he did, his words sounded distant and unwilling. Then Helen found a letter dated March 1891. It was from Thomas to a law firm in New Orleans. He asked about whether a debt holder could forgive the debt without the agreement of other family members who shared ownership. He asked for complete secrecy. Helen's hands shook as she read it. Thomas had been planning something. Over the following months, Thomas quietly spoke with lawyers in Louisiana and Mississippi. He was careful and always stressed the need for privacy. His father and brothers could not find out. By late 1892, he had his answer. Under Mississippi law, a debt holder could forgive a debt if they owned the contract alone. Thomas would need to buy out his family's share. In January 1893, Thomas told his father he wanted to invest in a textile mill in Jackson and needed his early inheritance, including his share of the labor contracts. Cornelius was pleased and agreed. Among them was Eliza's contract. On February 14, 1893, Thomas signed a document that Helen found between two other letters. It was a certificate of debt forgiveness. Eliza was free. Freedom was only the start. In 1893, Eliza was 35 years old. She had spent her whole life on the same land, working for the same family. She could not read. She had never left the county. She had never known a day without debt. Now Thomas offered her something she never thought possible. Helen found the next clues in Thomas's journal, hidden under the labor contracts. It covered the years 1892 to 1895. The entries were short but honest. March 3rd, 1893, told E that her debt is forgiven. She did not believe me at first. I showed her the paper. She cried for an hour. April 12th, 1893, E asked why I did this. I told her the truth. I have watched her suffer since I was a boy. I am ashamed of what my family has done. I want to make it right. July 29th, 1893. Fat R asked why E is no longer working in the fields. I told him she is ill. He does not suspect anything. November 15th, 1893. E and I have spoken every day for months. I did not expect this. I did not plan for this, but I cannot deny what I feel. The entries became more personal. Thomas and Eliza had fallen in love. A love that could not exist in their world. If anyone found out, Thomas would lose everything. Eliza could be killed, but Thomas had made his choice. January 8th, 1894. I asked E to marry me. She said yes. We both know what this means. We will have to leave. We will have to disappear. But I would rather live in exile with her than spend another day in my father's house. The wedding photograph was dated February 22nd, 1894. They married in secret, far from Thomas's family, and then they disappeared. Helen had always thought interracial marriage in 1894 Mississippi was impossible. The state's laws against it were very strict, with prison time for both people. So how did they marry? The answer came from a surprising place. While researching, Helen spoke with descendants of Natchez black community. One of them, a retired teacher named Cora, shared an old family story. My grandmother used to tell about a woman named Eliza who escaped from a plantation near here, Cora said. She said Eliza was helped by a white man who loved her. They went north to Illinois, where they could marry legally. Helen checked the records. In 1894, Illinois was one of the few states that allowed interracial marriage. The long train trip from Natchez to Illinois was dangerous, but they made it. Helen contacted the Cook County Archives in Chicago. 3 weeks later, she received a copy of the marriage certificate. Thomas and Eliza were married on February 22nd, 1894, in Chicago, Illinois, with a minister from the black community as witness. The photograph was taken that same day. They had traveled more than 700 miles to find a place where their love could be made legal. They had risked prison, violence, and even death for that one piece of paper. But what happened after? Thomas and Eliza did not stay in Chicago. The 1900 census showed them living in Adams County, Mississippi, with their 2 children. How did they return? And how did they survive? The answer was in the last pages of Thomas's journal. After the wedding, they lived quietly in Chicago for 3 years. Thomas worked as a bookkeeper, and Eliza took in laundry. Then in 1897, they heard that Thomas's father had died. William, the oldest brother, had taken over the family business. Robert had moved to Texas. Thomas wrote to William saying he had been in Chicago for business and wanted to come home. He said nothing about Eliza or their marriage. William agreed to sell him a small piece of land on the edge of the old family property, the same Victorian house where Helen would later find the photograph. Thomas and Eliza moved back to Mississippi in 1898. They lived quietly, staying away from Thomas's family. The local black community welcomed Eliza. White neighbors thought Thomas was a quiet man with unusual living arrangements. Their children, Samuel and Grace, were raised carefully at home, away from a world that would not accept them. The photograph stayed hidden in the leather trunk under Eliza's bed. It was their raw secret, their proof, and their promise. The peace could not last. In 1904, a local newspaper wrote about stricter laws against race mixing. The threat grew close. That same year, Thomas's brother William visited unexpectedly. Helen found the last journal entry describing that day, October 17th, 1904. William came today. He knows. Someone told him about Eliza and the children. He stood on the porch and called me a disgrace to the family name. He gave me 48 hours to send Eliza and the children away, or he would tell the sheriff. Thomas did not obey. Instead, he gathered all the documents that proved his family's crimes. The labor contracts, debt records, and evidence of beatings. He wrote a detailed letter to a newspaper editor in New Orleans, explaining the system of debt peonage that had kept hundreds of black workers in slavery long after emancipation. He sent the letter on October 19, 1904. Federal investigators soon arrived in Adams County. William was arrested. The family's remaining land was taken. The trapped workers were finally set free. Thomas was never charged. His help with the investigation protected him and his family, but he was cut off by white society. His name was removed from local records. He did not mind. In his final letter to the editor, Thomas wrote, "I have spent my life trying to repair what my family destroyed. I do not expect forgiveness. I only hope that my children will live in a world where love is not a crime." Helen finished her research in the spring of 2024. She had spent 8 months following the lives of Thomas and Eliza, putting their story together from old records, journals, and family memories. What she found was a story of great courage. 2 people who fought against the harshest rules of their time with nothing but love and determination. Thomas died in 1923, at the age of 67. Eliza lived until 1935. They were buried, side by side in a small cemetery outside Natchez. Their graves had only simple stones with their first names. Their children, Samuel and Grace, grew up quietly. Samuel became a carpenter. Grace worked as a seamstress. They never married and never spoke in public about their parents' story. The photograph stayed hidden in the leather trunk, passed down until it reached Dorothy, their great-granddaughter, who kept it safe until she died. Helen now understood why it had been hidden for so long. For over 100 years, the story of Thomas and Eliza had been too dangerous to tell. It broke the easy stories white Southerners told themselves about the end of slavery. It showed the cruel truth of debt, peonage. It proved that love could cross the color line even when every law tried to stop it. But now, at last, the story could be told. Helen published her findings in a historical journal that fall. The article was shared by national news. Historians and family researchers began looking for other hidden marriages and forgotten stories of love and resistance. Cora, the retired teacher, came to Natchez to visit Thomas and Eliza's graves. She brought flowers and placed a copy of the wedding photograph against the stones. "You deserved better," she said softly, "but you made your own kind of justice." The scars on Eliza's hands spoke of her pain and suffering, but the photograph told a stronger story, a story of survival, of courage, and of a love that refused to be erased. And now, the world would finally know.